Meanwhile, let's shed some light on the Democrats' glaring hypocrisy in accusing Republicans of undermining the Mueller investigation that I just alluded to. Now, you'll recall Democrats did everything they could to undermine Ken Starr's Whitewater investigation into misdeeds by President Clinton. And you compare what Democrats are saying now with what they said back then.
There is a growing concern, I can tell you, in the Senate in the sense that Mr. Starr is now operating out of any sense of reasonable behavior.
We get a politically motivated prosecutor who is allied with the right-wing opponents of my husband, who has literally spent 4 years looking at every telephone...
$30 million.
And more than that now, but looking at every telephone call we've made, every check we've ever written.
This is a president who, on many issues, is basically beyond shame at this point. So any sense of fairness or thoroughness for the sake of the investigation, I think, is questionable from the White House.
He is trying to distract and distract attention from the Russia investigation and to discredit whatever Mueller says in the end.
I love that. Let's go to the man who was in the eye of the storm back then. Former independent counsel Ken Starr joins us from Washington, and Harvard Law professor emeritus Alan Dershowitz is in Miami. Now, guys, before we get into the Russia probe, I need to get your thoughts on this uproar over the staff secretary, Rob Porter. He's now accused by a couple of ex-wives of abusive behavior. And this was an absolute firestorm in the White House briefing room today. Professor Dershowitz, your reaction to the pretty quick takedown of Rob Porter.
Well, I want to make a more general point. I think anybody who is accused by the Me Too people or anybody else and who denies it should have an opportunity to make their case, to present their argument. Used to be that it was a she said, he said dispute. Now it's a she said and you can't even respond dispute. Both sides have to be heard. A process has to be put in place, whether in the White House, in Congress, anywhere else. Whether it's a Republican, like in this case, or a Democrat, like Al Franken, there has to be an opportunity for both sides to present evidence, and there has to be a fair process for determining who's telling the truth. Sometimes it's obvious. Sometimes it's clear. But even in the Bill Cosby case, where it seemed so obvious to everybody, the jury came back with a hung jury. So we need to have a process. We can't suspend due process just because there's a movement afoot that is making some very, very important points. But we need due process.
Judge Starr, now the move seems to be to take down General Kelly, because Kelly's worked side by side with him. And even as one of his ex-wives said, I don't want him to lose his position in the White House. He's incredibly smart. He's incredibly dedicated to his job. But I personally had they had a bad relationship, according to her. But now they're saying Kelly's got to go because Kelly actually stood up for his integrity because, as Alan Dershowitz said, these were accusations and hadn't seen a photo or anything like that, I guess.
Right. General Kelly, I think, was waiting for the evidence. And when the evidence came in, from what we know, he responded. And he responded decisively, which you would expect of a good military man. And let me just add to what Alan said, and I agree with what he said. We need to be reminded in this country, as we were reminded by the Felix Frankfurter and many other justices and great jurists, that the history of liberty in the United States is largely the history of procedure. Throw away procedure, throw away due process, and you have a very different kind of state. You do not have a rule of law system. It is precious, and so rushes to judgment are to be avoided. So let's get the evidence in, evaluate, assess the evidence. I think from what we know, that's what General Kelly was doing.
Yeah, and let's move on from that to what's happening today. To what's happening today in the Russian investigation. Professor Dershowitz, we now know that the Clintons paid for that dossier. It looks like Sidney Blumenthal was involved. An old Clinton hand. I mean, Judge Starr knows about him very well. Was funneling information to Christopher Steele as well. Some of it looks like it ended up in that dossier, or a second dossier that ended up funneling in, perhaps in some way, shape, or form, to that FISA judge. And yet, Democrats will say, well, that's not dispositive. The search warrant to follow Carter Page was not only based in part on that dossier. So you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Well, we don't know what
Professor.
the FISA court decided, how much weight they gave anything. We don't know how much weight was given by the FISA court to any particular aspect. What we do know is that people who file an application ex parte in front of a court have a special obligation to present all sides and to make sure that if they're relying on something and they know there are questions about its credibility because of its source, they have an obligation to present it fulsomely to the court. Now, there's a footnote, apparently, in the application that does say that it came from a partisan source. That's not good enough. You need to act as if the defense is presenting their side, because you have an obligation to present both sides of the issue. And again, as Ken said, it's all about process. Process is the way in which we achieve fairness, and I think there were real problems with the process here. I'm waiting to see the Democratic memo. I want to hear both sides of the issue, but at the moment, I think there was a breakdown of process.
Judge Starr, as a former federal appellate court judge, when you think about this FISA judge, we don't know who it is. I guess there were a number of judges involved in reviewing these applications. If a material fact had been withheld in that application to spy on an American citizen, and a material fact is the opposition candidate paid for the dossier, among other things. Is there any recourse for the judge at this point? Is there sanctions that can be filed against certain Justice Department attorneys? I mean, we had Joe DeGenova on the show the other night, Judge, who said he thought there could be ethical issues for the FBI and maybe even criminal charges if indeed there was some type of conspiracy to keep this information.
Well, it's serious. So let's not rush to judgment. Let's be consistent and say we need to know how that FISA application for the renewal was in fact prepared. Who prepared it? What did they know? When did they know it? And so I do think that this is a very serious issue for the reasons that Alan stated. And there's another dimension of this. The FISA regime was designed to provide a judicial check on what might otherwise be untrammeled executive excess, potential abuses. And so there is a very special call it a fiduciary relationship that I think is very deep, probably as deep as it gets. There always should be honesty and transparency with the court. There's no excuse for anything short of that. But it's all the more sensitive when you're talking about the power of the executive branch to spy on American citizens.
To go back and read your emails ad infinitum. There's one more soundbite I want to play for you guys. Professor Dershowitz, this was Eric Holder, former Attorney General, speaking out today. Let's watch.
If one looks at the dismissal of James Comey and the reasons why the president told Lester Holt he did that, if you look at the president's attempts to try to get people who were the heads of the intelligence agencies to get involved in this matter, if you look at the president's actions on the airplane with regard to that statement, there are a variety of other things. I think you technically have a case of obstruction of justice.
Professor Dershowitz, your reaction to that very quickly.
Well, I think he's wrong. President George Bush I did practically the same thing when it came to Iran-Contra. He pardoned Caspar Weinberger and a handful of other witnesses who could have pointed the finger at him. Nobody suggested obstruction of justice. A president can't obstruct justice, in my view, if he simply exercises his constitutional authority. He has to do something like suborn perjury, destroy evidence, pay hush money the way Nixon did.
Yeah,
and that hasn't
Eric Holder has an interesting way of looking at these facts, but I knew Dersh would get it right, as usual. The dynamic duo, you guys, fantastic. Thank you so much. And by the way, it's ironic, don't you think, how the Democrats keep peddling this false story of Trump's collusion with Russia?